Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into some heavy strategic discussions that are shaping Israel's path forward.
Yeah, we're looking at a future being hammered out right now, dealing with the war in Gaza, obvious, but also huge internal political force.
And our source material for this, it's pretty unique. We've gone through transcripts from a recent conference, mainly broadcast on the C4.
Right, and this isn't your standard news report. You're hearing directly from the top brass, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Ministers Ben-Gvir and Katz, even someone like former Ambassador David Friedman weighing in. It's unfiltered strategic talk.
Exactly. It feels much more like a declaration of intent, So our mission for you listening is to be your guide, well, often very hardline.
We're pulling out the main strategic threads. How are they actually defining absolute victory in Gaza? What's the plan? And crucially, this simultaneous, very strong push for Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. If you want to get your head around the high-stakes vision driving Israeli policy right now, military, political, even domestic, this is the deep dive.
Okay, so let's start where they started. The immediate, painful reality of the war and how the military thinking is shifting.
Yeah, you can't talk strategy without first acknowledging the cost. It was striking how much time in these discussions was spent on the human sacrifice.
They specifically mentioned the recent loss of 4 soldiers in Rafah Major Omri Hai Ben Moshe, Lieutenant Ron Arieli, Lieutenant Abner Ben Yitzhak.
And seeing their units listed: paratroopers, Golani, Commando, Seret Matkal, regulars, reservists.
Yeah, he really drives home that this isn't just, one sector paying the price. It cuts across all of Israeli society. It impacts everyone.
And Netanyahu's description of that loss, it was incredibly visceral.
It was. He talked about it feeling like having limbs severed, like being suddenly disabled, he said, like the nation's life light being extinguished. And he framed it very stark. The only thing that makes this sacrifice bearable, the only justification, is that their heroism is what guarantees the nation.
Right, and that framing is so important because it elevates the goal from just, a tactical objective to something existential.
Which makes that demand for absolute victory seem, from their perspective, completely non-negotiable.
Exactly. And to get there, the military strategy itself, and it's seen a major shift, a doctrinal change, really.
Yeah, Defense Minister Katz, he drew a very clear line. They're moving away completely from the old ways of handling Gaza conflicts.
The old in-and-out raids, as he called them.
Right. Go in, hit something, pull back out.
And Katz pointed out, those just didn't work long-term. The forces leave, Hamas pops right back up out of the tunnels, regroups, reasserts control.
And then you just have to do it all over again later.
Precisely. So the new approach is very different. It's deliberate. It's meant to be permanent, clear and hold.
Clear the territory of all the terror infrastructure, then hold that ground, actually stay there, and only then push forward.
And Netanyahu, he actually gave a number. He claimed something like 80% of the Gaza Strip territory is currently being held.
Leaving Hamas, according to him, sort of concentrated in their last couple of strongs.
Now, the tactics they're using for this clear and hold, Katz described them as unprecedented. He talked about the sheer intensity of firepower being used before ground troops even go in.
He used a really stark Hebrew phrase, scorched earth, Adama Harucha.
Yeah, and that apparently includes the very deliberate destruction of high-rise buildings, big apartments.
They say we're being used explicitly by Hamas.
Yeah.
For command posts, observation, staging attacks.
Exactly. The idea behind this scorched earth approach, from a strategic point of view, is to eliminate any potential cover, any staging point Hamas could possibly use to come back later.
So when they hold the territory, there's physically nothing left for Hamas to return to.
It's a grim acknowledgement, really, of what urban warfare against an enemy this deeply embedded involves. It seems they feel it requires destroying their environment completely.
Okay, so that leads to the operational side. How do you isolate the enemy fighter from the civilian?
Well, Katz detailed this process. First, warnings, calls for evacuation. He mentioned aiming for, 600,000 to 700,000 residents out of maybe 1 million in certain zones to leave.
And the purpose of that mass evacuation
is to enable what they call a full siege Mitzer Mukhlef on the areas the troops are about to enter.
And the implication of that is?
Extremely hard line. The stated intent is to draw a clear line. Civilians out, combatants remain.
And military leadership's position, as reported in these sources, is that anyone who chooses to stay behind in those besieged areas after the warning
will be considered a combatant, assumed to be Hamas or actively supporting them.
Which then allows for, presumably, a much less constrained use of force in those zones.
It seems so. Prioritizing the total elimination of, everything and everyone remaining in that designated area.
Okay, so military victory achieved. Hypothetically. Then what? The day after question. And this is where former Ambassador David Friedman chimed in with a really ambitious plan.
Yeah, ambitious and definitely controversial. His starting point was practical, almost mundane. He argued that Gaza is basically uninhabitable for the next 4 or 5 years.
Uninhabitable because
The sheer destruction, think about it, unexploded bombs, massive amounts of rubble, destroyed infrastructure, water, power. It needs a colossal cleanup effort.
Okay, so if it needs cleaning up, how does that lead to his proposal?
His idea centers on temporary mass immigration or relocation for the Gazan residents.
Okay, hang on. Mass relocation, that sounds politically explosive.
He framed it not as a political goal, but as a logistical necessity. You can't do the cleanup, he argued, with people living amongst the rubble and the unexploded ordnance.
And you certainly can't attract the international investment needed for rebuilding under those conditions.
Exactly. His vision, long-term, was actually quite, capitalistic. He talked about a cleaned-up Gaza becoming potentially magnificent western-facing beachfront real estate.
Wow.
But only after the population is temporarily moved elsewhere to allow this massive, multi-year cleanup.
But he must know how that sounds international. The immediate reaction is ethnic cleansing, right? He addressed that.
He did, head on. He brought up what he called international hypocrisy.
How so?
He pointed to the Syrian civil war. 5 million refugees fled Syria, and the world, correctly he said, called it a rescue operation.
Okay.
Yet, he argued, when Israel suggests, even for practical cleanup reasons, providing temporary safe options for Gazans outside the Strip.
It's immediately condemned.
Right. He sees a clear double standard there.
But wait a second. Isn't that plan, regardless of his justification, just politically dead on arrival? Given the guaranteed international backlash he himself pointed out, how could Israel possibly implement something the world has already labeled ethnic cleansing, even if they argue it's temporary and necessary for rebuilding?
That's the massive diplomatic hurdle, absolutely. And Friedman didn't really offer a magic solution to that political problem. His argument seemed to lean more on the idea that, practical outcomes might eventually override ideological objections.
Meaning, if somehow this temporary relocation led to a safer, rebuilt Gaza down the line, maybe the world would eventually, grudgingly, accept the meat.
That seemed to be the hope, yeah. But the sources definitely acknowledged the political cost would be enormous. It's banking on a very long-term hypothetical acceptance based on result, while facing immediate, tense condemnation. A huge gamble. #2. The aid dilemma and humanitarian security.
Okay, so this whole discussion about cleanup, potential relocation, it flows right into the massive controversy over humanitarian aid going into Gaza.
Oh, absolutely. And for many of the speakers at this conference, particularly the more hardline voices, aid isn't just a logistical issue. It's an immediate security threat.
National Security Minister Ben-Gvir was, let's say, very direct about it.
Extremely direct. He used some really provocative language. He actually labeled the aid effort itself a humanitarian terror attack. Pigua humanitarian.
Wow, a humanitarian terror attack. What's the reasoning behind language like that?
Well, his perspective seems completely zero-sum. You just don't supply your enemy during wartime, full stop. Especially, he argued, when Israeli hostages are being held, potentially starving. He believes the aid inevitably ends up supporting Hamas, logistically or otherwise.
But it wasn't just about strengthening Hamas, was it? The core argument seemed to be about immediate risk.
Exactly. The risk to Israeli soldiers and Israeli civilians right now needed something concrete to back that up.
And they pointed to a specific tragic incident.
They did. The security incident at the Allenby crossing. Minister Karhi and Ben-Gvir both brought this up. They detailed how a driver involved in transferring aid across the bridge, apparently an employee in the Jordanian side, turned out to be a terrorist.
And that driver then went on to kill 2 Israeli citizens.
Right. For Ben-Gvir and Karhi, that was the proof. That was the smoking gun, as you might say.
Their argument, this proves the aid process itself creates dangerous security vulnerabilities.
Yes, Ben-Gvir stated it explicitly. The movement of aid actively endangers Israeli security personnel and fighters. It gives cover, creates opportunities for attack.
So, based on that incident, the demand was pretty blunt.
Close the crossings, halt the aid flow entirely, or at least significantly curtail it. For these leaders, the perceived diplomatic benefit of allowing aid is completely outweighed by the direct security cost.
It's interesting, though, this focus on physical security, aid trucks, crossings. It was also connected by one speaker to a much broader, almost philosophical battle.
You're talking about MK Avimai's.
Yeah. He took the security failures of October 7th and linked them to something he called internal spiritual warfare.
Right. His argument, as presented, was that the root cause of the October 7th breakdown wasn't just tactical or intelligence failure. It was deeper, stemming from political ideologies that had weakened Israel.
Specifically, he named the Oslo concept and progressive culture. Let's just unpack that for the listener who might not be familiar. What's the Oslo concept short?
It represents the whole land for peace paradigm that dominated Israeli thinking for decades after the Oslo. The belief that trading territory would eventually bring security and acceptance.
And Mao sees that as
fundamentally flawed. A weak, almost defeatist ideology in his that led Israel to rely on concessions and external goodwill instead of projecting absolute strength and deterrence.
Okay. And how does progressive culture fit into that critique?
He seems to view the influence of progressive social value, things like focus on individual rights over national duty, perhaps multiculturalism, challenges to traditional identities as corrosive, particularly within key institutions like the military and government.
Corrosive how? Undermining national unity.
That seems to be the implication, eroding the necessary cohesion, the strong Jewish identity that he believes is essential for maintaining unwavering deterrence.
So for Mao's, winning the war isn't just about defeating Hamas militarily.
No, it's a two-front war in his telling. You need the military victory, yes, but you also need this internal ideological purification. You need to strengthen Jewish identity, root out these progressive influences.
As prerequisites for restoring total deterrence and achieving real, lasting security.
It connects the battlefield directly to internal Israeli cultural and political debates.
Okay, so you have the Gaza campaign, these intense debates about aid and ideology. But underlying all of it, the core political objective that kept coming up again and again at this conference
was applying Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, the West Bank.
And this wasn't presented as some distant dream. Leaders like Ben-Gvir, Karhi, Mao's, they were framing it as both necessary and, importantly, achievable now.
Right. The current war, the current situation, is seen by them as providing the perfect momentum, the ideal window of opportunity for this major historical move. It's not just a reaction, it's seen as destiny, the right thing to do for security.
And interestingly, David Friedman, the former U.S. ambassador, he offered a rationale that tried to flip the usual narrative on its head.
Yeah, he argued that applying Israeli sovereignty shouldn't be viewed as a punishment for the Palestinians living there,
but as something beneficial.
That was his argument. Highly controversial, obviously, but he posited that Israeli sovereignty is actually good for the Arab minority.
On what basis?
He pointed to the status of Arab citizens within Israel proper, their relative economic success, their integration into professions like law, medicine, high-tech, commerce. He argued Israel is the only country in the region with a track record of actually empowering an Arab minority.
So the suggestion is extending sovereignty would bring that stability and opportunity to the Arabs in Judea and Samaria, surpassing the current.
That's the framing. To present sovereignty not as conquest, but as the pathway to genuine stability and economic progress for everyone living there, based on Israel's internal record.
A very bold claim, given the likely Palestine.
Extremely bold. But Friedman himself added a crucial caveat. For this to have any chance of working, internationally or even practically,
it needs incredibly detailed planning. It can't just be a symbolic.
Absolutely. He stressed this point. You need answers for everything. How do people travel between towns under the new system? Who pays for water? Electricity? What specific rights, what legal status do the current residents get?
Without that groundwork, it just looks like annexation, not governance.
Precisely. His point was that only meticulous planning allows you to present it globally as a step toward stability, rather than just a land grab.
Now, the timing for this push seems very much driven by external factors, too.
Yes, specifically the fear or expectation of other countries moving to recognize a Palestinian state.
Minister Karhi and the head of the Yesha Council, the Settler Council, were explicit about this. They see that potential wave of recognition as a prize for terror.
And therefore, Israel needs to act first. Apply sovereignty as a strong preemptive counter-response. Cement the reality on the ground before the diplomatic landscape shifts against them.
It's about creating facts on the ground. What about the big player, though, the U.S.?
That was it. The head of the Yesha Council, Shlomi Eliyahu, mentioned recent meetings in the U.S. And apparently, the main American pushback wasn't necessarily don't do it.
Oh, what was it then?
It was more about Israel lacking a clear plan, a coherent vision. The message they reportedly got was something like, the U.S. will respect a sovereign democratic Israel, but you need to tell us clearly what you actually want.
Which suggests maybe less outright opposition and more a demand for strategic clarity from Washington.
It could be interpreted that way.
Yep.
And Netanyahu seemed to echo this when he said, successful diplomacy here requires talking less and acting more decisively.
Implying that if Israel presents a clear, well-planned fait accompli,
the U.S. might ultimately defer to Israeli self-determination on this rather than actively trying to block it. Again, a gamble, but it reflects their reading of the current U.S. administration.
Okay, but even within the Israeli right-wing camp pushing for this, there's a pretty significant internal debate there about the scope of sovereignty.
Oh, definitely. It's not monolithic. How much land do you actually apply sovereignty to, given the large Palestinian population?
You've got the sort of maximalist ideological view.
Right, championed by someone like M.K. Mao's. His position is rooted purely in historical and religious claims. Sovereignty over all of Judea and Samaria, maybe even Gaza eventually, because it's all seen as the biblical inheritance of the Jewish people. It's all or nothing.
But then there's the more pragmatic approach, which seemed to be the focus of the strategic discussion.
Yes. The approach put forward by the Yesha Council leadership, which seems to have more traction in terms of actual planning. They're talking about applying sovereignty to a specific portion, 82% of the territory.
82%. That's very specific. What does that 82% actually include? And crucially, what does it leave out?
It includes Area C, which Israel already fully controls, militarily and civilly, plus the open, largely unpopulated areas within Areas A and B.
Areas A and B being the areas under Palestinian Authority administration.
Correct. But they are specifically excluding the densely populated Palestinian cities and towns within Areas A and B.
Ah, so places like Ramallah, Nab, Jenin, Hebron city center, they would remain outside of sovereignty.
That's the core of the strategy. It's explicitly designed as maximum territory, minimum population.
So if they claim 82% of what's the strategic payoff of deliberately leaving out those big population centers in the remaining?
It avoids, or at least postpones indefinitely, the massive political and demographic challenge of absorbing millions of Palestinians into Israel proper.
Meaning Israel wouldn't immediately have to grant citizenship, voting rights, social benefits to millions of additional.
Exactly. You secure control over the vast majority of the land, the strategic high ground, the road networks, the resources, without fundamentally altering the demographic balance of the state of Israel overnight.
It's a strategy aimed at security control and demographic stability for Israel, while effectively encircling the main Palestinian population.
That appears to be the pragmatic calculation being discussed at the highest levels. Securing the land, managing the demographic implication, #4, global deterrence, and the axis of...
Okay, so shifting from the internal governance plans for Judea and Samaria to Israel's posture, the sources indicated a really significant change in thinking there.
Yeah, it's moved beyond just reacting or containing threats locally. There's a sense that the last year, the ongoing conflict has forced a fundamental shift.
Experts at the conference, like Samamian and Winner, they talked about Israeli security doctrine evolving into proactive global...
Right, taking the fight directly to the entire axis of evil, Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen. Not just defending against them, but actively disrupting and degrading them wherever they...
It's presented as a demonstration of Israel's strength and independence, proving it sustain long, complex, distant campaigns on its own.
And the absolute number one target in this proactive doctrine, the existential threat they keep returning to, is Iran.
Netanyahu himself framed the Iranian threat in stark terms. He called it two tumors needing simultaneous...
What were the two tumors, according to him?
Tumor one, the nuclear bomb project itself, the actual facilities, the scientists, the know-how to build a weapon.
And tumor two,
the delivery system. He mentioned 20,000 ballistic missiles, not just in Iran, but spread among proxies across the region, capable of hitting Israel.
So it's the weapon and the means to use it. And Netanyahu then spoke quite openly, it seems, about actions taken against the first tumor.
Yes, he confirmed essentially the long-rumored historic operation to disrupt the nuclear program.
What's involved?
A series of covert operations, eliminating key Iranian atomic scientists, destroying critical facilities. Yeah. Basically, actions designed to significantly set back their progress and buy Israel time. And here's where that theme of absolute national independence.
It is. Netanyahu apparently made a point of clarifying how that major disruption operation was executed.
He stated explicitly that Israel carried it out without notifying the United States beforehand.
Wow. Taking unilateral action of that magnitude against Iran's nuclear program without telling your main ally.
Yeah, that's a significant statement. What does that decision, that willingness to act alone on such a critical issue, tell you about their strategic mindset now?
Well, it suggests a profound level of self-reliance, or perhaps a lack of trust, that seeking permission wouldn't lead to delays or opposition. Netanyahu apparently added that he believed President Trump was generally supportive of neutralizing the threat, but the operational decision was made unilaterally.
The justification given was that securing the existence of the Jewish state required immediate, decisive action, potentially unhindered by external consultation.
It really underlines this shift towards prioritizing independent action on perceived existential threats.
And speaking of controversial long-range action, the discussions also touched on targeting Hamas leadership outside of Gaza.
Specifically mentioning the strikes, or attempted strike, on figures in Doha, Qatar, which of course caused a huge international uproar.
Right. Operating in a third country, especially one like Qatar that hosts U.S. bases and plays a diplomatic role, that shows how far this new enforcement doctrine extends.
It risks major diplomatic fallout, clearly. But Defense Minister Katz doubled down on it. He reaffirmed the commitment to eliminate Hamas leaders wherever they are,
stating explicitly that the message is there is no immunity for the heads of terror anywhere.
So the shift seems absolute. Geography, diplomatic cover, none of it provides sanctuary anymore if you're deemed a high-value enemy leader. The reach is global now. #5, domestic political environment, and the judicial system.
Okay, so while Israel is projecting this image of strength and proactive enforcement abroad, the picture painted of the domestic political scene in these sources is, well, quite fraught.
Yeah, intensely volatile seems like the right word. Lots of internal friction, particularly within the governing coalition itself, and this ongoing battle with the judicial system.
A major point of recent instability mentioned was the failure to pass the conscription law, the Gaius law.
Right. MK Michael Malkeli from the ultra-Orthodox Shas party, he confirmed the Shas essentially withdrew from active participation in the government, though not the coalition entirely because this law wasn't moving forward.
Even though there were apparently signed coalition agreements promising it would.
That's what he claimed. And this law is, of course, hugely sensitive. For listeners, the core issue is about drafting ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students into the military. Without a formal law providing exemption, these young men technically face conscription and potential arrest if they refuse.
And Malkeli pointed fingers for the delay.
He did. He cited specific resistance from within Netanyahu's own Likud party. He named Defense Minister Gallant and MK Yuli Edelstein as key figures blocking the law.
Why would they block it, a Cohen promise?
Political complexities, presumably. Forcing mass conscription on the ultra-Orthodox community, especially during a major war, is politically explosive for the mainstream parties, too. But for Shas, it reached the breaking point.
They couldn't stay fully in a government, Malkeli argued, while their constituents were facing arrest.
Exactly. So their position now is pass the law as agreed, and we'll fully resume our ministerial role. Until then, we support the right-wing bloc, but we're not fully participating in the executive.
Okay, so that's one major internal fault line. And then there's the other ongoing conflict, the war, as some call it, on the judicial system.
Yeah, this came up repeatedly, particularly targeting the independence of the Attorney General, or legal advisor to the government, and the Supreme Court, known as Begets.
Justice Minister Yariv Levin wasn't mentioned here, but Communications Minister Shlomo Karh, who also holds justice-related, was very
critical of the Attorney General, accusing her of constantly interfering in policy decisions that he believes should be the sole domain of the elected government.
And his stance towards court orders?
Extremely hardline. Karhi argued that judicial orders that, in his view, clearly contradict written law or go beyond the court's proper authority, well, they simply shouldn't be obeyed.
He gave an example.
Yeah, something about the Supreme Court extending the terms of board members on some body against the government's wishes. His position is, if the court overstepped, the government isn't bound by its ruling. That's a direct challenge to judicial review, to the separation of powers.
And then Minister Ben-Gvir took this conflict to another level with a really startling accusation against the Attorney General.
He did. He accused her office, essentially, of running a protection racket.
Protection racket? What did he mean by that?
He claimed the Attorney General uses the threat of legal action, like supporting petitions to have ministers dismissed or opening investigations to pressure ministers into making appointments or decisions that align with their preferences, basically using legal threats for political leverage.
That's an incredibly serious charge of institutional corruption. Did he give specifics?
He mentioned a specific case involving an appointment of a police officer where he felt he was being pressured by the legal advisors, and he framed his resistance as refusing to be extorted.
So what does this deep animosity between key ministers and the state's legal system tell us about how things are functioning right now?
It suggests the conflict is deeply personal and institutional. These ministers don't see the legal system as a check or balance anymore, but as a hostile political entity actively working to undermine their government's mandate. The friction seems immense.
And finally, amidst all this, MK Maoz raised another alarming point about the general political atmosphere.
Yeah, he expressed really grave concerns about political toxicity and incite, specifically directed, he claimed, against the religious right.
Warning about the risk of
the next political murder. His argument was that law enforcement he named the Attorney General, the Shin Bet Internal Security Service, the the police commissioner, are deliberately failing to investigate serious threats made against right-wing Knesset members,
creating, in his view, a dangerous atmosphere where political violence becomes thinkable, even permissible.
That was his warning, that the failure to take these threats seriously is paving the way for potential tragedy.
So putting it all together, these transcripts paint a picture of a leadership fighting a brutal external war with radical tactics, while simultaneously locked in intense internal power struggles and expressing deep distrust, of course, all driven by this overarching push for, well, total national independence, #ouch.
Yeah, if you synthesize everything we've heard from these sources, the Gaza battle plan, the sovereignty push, the global posture, the domestic fight, it coalesces into this unified, very aggressive vision.
A vision aimed squarely at asserting total independence, almost trying to shed reliance on or deference to external powers or even internal check.
The core takeaway seems to be this twin mandate. First, achieve absolute military victory in Gaza, using whatever means necessary, siege tactics, and potentially score.
And second, immediately translate that military momentum into political act, applying sovereignty over most of Judea.
They see these as fundamentally. The military action provides the opportunity. The political action sovereignty is meant to lock in long-term security on their terms.
It connects everything: the strikes on Iran without telling the U.S., targeting leaders in Qatar, pushing sovereignty despite international opinion, fighting the domestic.
Exactly. They seem to view all these as different facets of the same overarching goal, asserting Israel's absolute right to define and defend its own existence, free from the constraints of the old Oslo concept or the need for external diplomatic green.
Which brings us to a final, quite pointed thought for you, the listener. We talked about the pragmatic sovereignty plan,
the one focusing on maximum territory, minimum population, by applying sovereignty to 82% of Judea and Samaria.
Right. It strategically excludes the major Palestinian population center, leaving them in the remaining percent of the territory. So the question, what is the intended or likely long-term status of the millions of Palestinians living in that non-sovereign percent?
If they are effectively living in enclave, surrounded by permanent Israeli sovereignty, what does that mean for their future, for their movement, their economy, their political aspirations, and critically, for Israel's own long-term security challenge, managing those areas?
How viable, how stable can that arrangement be? That's the unanswered question hanging over the pragmatic strategy, something to definitely keep thinking.
Indeed. Well, that brings us to the end of this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.